I'd like to welcome to the stage for our next panel event members of 2 political caucuses. You could make your way to the stage. Nope. There's just 3 of us at this one, so it's a little bit smaller. So the title of this panel is Political Shifts and What the New Majority Needs to Know About the Political Landscape, Economic Development and Job Creation, and also Challenges to EEO and Affirmative Action. So that's the title. It's a lot. That's a lot. But we'll get to all of it. So joining me here on stage, this is Congresswoman Meng, Congressman Gregory Meeks. Oh yeah, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you for being here. And thank you for getting here. I was worried. They came here. They just got here. I always worry, but you guys made it always, as always, just in the nick of time. I'm gonna introduce you to them in just a moment, but I want to tell you that. So today's panel, this is for the 2-day event. This is the only panel that we have where we have political leaders, elected officials here. So we just want to make sure that all of your questions are answered, and you guys bring a really different perspective to this particular audience. And so there really are 2 goals based on that for this panel. We want to get your political perspective from Washington on the new majority, and we also, in terms of what you're seeing with this current administration and policy, and also we want your advice and recommendations for new majority business leaders. And by new majority, people were asking me this in the bathroom too. Again, we're just using when we were all in line. Not, that just sounded really weird. There was a really long line during the break for the bathroom, and that was one of the things we were talking about. What is the new majority? There's always a line in the women's bathroom. It's like you get a lot accomplished though. You can talk. The new majority we're defining as, this year, this event is not just for Asian American business leaders, but a combination of Asian American business leaders, African American business leaders, Hispanic business leaders, Native American, all minorities sort of collectively coming together and how to capitalize on that. So that's kind of what we're here to accomplish. So, Congresswoman Meng, just a quick introduction. She is Vice Chair of the Democratic National Committee, and she's the first Asian American member of Congress from New York State, and the only Congress member of Asian descent in the entire Northeast. Yeah. That's gonna, hopefully we'll have more and more. And Congressman Gregory Meeks has been a fierce advocate for expanding opportunities for businessmen and women of color. He's a co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Task Force on Economic Development and Wealth Creation, and as a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, he has advocated for the Modernizing for Community Reinvestment Act to strengthen financial institutions' affirmative obligation to serve low and moderate income individuals, and also he's played a role in breaking down racial and gender barriers in corporate boardrooms and C-suites, as well as encouraging diversity in the public and private sector workplaces. So that's just a brief introduction. Their full bios, as May was saying, their bios are on page 18 of the program if you want to check that out. And I just want to remind all of you that if you want to write your questions on a card for them throughout, you can, and just hold it up. And then also we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So that's what's going to happen for the next half hour or so. I reached out to some of my contacts for questions. I have a journalist background and I've covered politics recently, but I wanted to make sure that this was useful to you, so that's why I'm talking about your questions as well. But I also reached out to contacts and to some of you already today to get some of these questions. But I guess we first wanted to start out with, if you could just describe the political landscape as you see it for the new majority, for minority business leaders right now, given the current administration and the climate that you have. What challenges to minority business leaders, what challenges do you see them face in terms of economic development, job creation, access to capital? What are you seeing personally firsthand? You're closer, so I'll start with you. That's the only.
We have some unique challenges, and I think that we have some opportunities also. The challenges that we have on the political scene is the rollback of some of the regulations that were put in place by President Obama to try to make sure that we are aware of the diversity that corporate America and others were having. For example, the recent rollback by President Trump of the EEOC's regulation that they do not have to notify individuals of what the ethnicities are of the individuals in their respective organizations. That's a problem because we've got to identify who's doing what. And the fact that individuals who are getting public contracts, I mean, I've had a bill in to say that those that are getting public contracts should be able to divulge the diversity, for example, within their boards. Because I think that a lot of it starts from the top down. And we've got to have the kind of diversity at a board level that will speak to the diversity of this country so that we can impact it. And it seems as though that the administration, the current administration, is rolling back some of those pieces. And I know that being in business, we understand that we look at regulations and some were overburdened and some were not. And so we're talking, going back and forth as to what's the right balance, because that's always the question. I know sitting on the Financial Services Committee, where we had Dodd-Frank, for example, we know that there are some things that were unintended consequences. But we also know that without Dodd-Frank, we would not have been able to dig out of the financial crises of 2008. So how do you get that balance right is a question of what we're moving in. But also, how do you make sure that people are included on a diverse level from corporate boards to the C-suites and then all the way down? And I just have extreme concerns because it seems as though when it gets to that part of it, this president seems to have no regard for it.
And part of what I want to get to today, briefly in this half hour, are some suggestions or solutions to some of these issues that you're bringing up but before we do that, I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen challenges to minority, business leaders in terms of economic development, job creation. What challenges have you seen?
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being here today. It's a tremendous honor to be here in front of all of you and be able to have this conversation, especially with my esteemed colleague and one of our top New York leaders in the New York Congressional delegation. This term, new majority, is a term that I first learned, I guess, sometime during college. And I was very confused because as wonderful and diverse as New York City and Queens is, I never thought of myself as any phrase that would contain the word majority. But John first taught me about it. John's one of the folks that got me involved in politics. So on a good day, I thank him. On a bad day, I blame him. But the concept of a new majority and our numbers in our communities are only growing and expanding. In Congress, we have the 3 caucuses, which we refer to as the Tri-Caucus. And in Congress, our numbers are still not there. Less than 20% of Congress members are people of color. There are only, in the history of the United States Congress, only 67 women of color have ever been elected to Congress. And that's in the entire history. And so our problems didn't just start last year, but these are a long-term situation that I thank you, many of the business leaders in the room, that don't just face those of us in political circles, but in our business world, in our nonprofit world, and academia, in journalism. These are all issues that we need to focus on. And the Tri-Caucus, regardless of if you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think we can all agree that political times in the last year have become very unpredictable, and that there are a lot of folks, whether they're our constituents or your customer base, that have felt increasingly nervous, and sometimes, quite honestly, made to feel that they are not truly American. And so this is something that growing up in New York, growing up as a person in a community of color, we have, and you have, led the fight for decades. And so this is something that we have to continue to work on. I know that the panel prior to ours talked about diversity and inclusion, and I think that is so important. KPAC, our Asian caucus, is working on a report, and I know the Congressional Black Caucus has done so much work in this area, but we're working on a report on best practices for businesses on how to achieve and improve diversity and inclusion, best practices and methods. So I'm happy to work with you on all of those.
I just want to press you on the first part. Are there any specific challenges that you've seen in your day-to-day interaction that minority business leaders face that maybe they didn't before, or is there anything specific?
Sure. I mean, right in Queens, many of our small business leaders, and Nydia would obviously be the best person to speak about this. She's the ranking member on the Small Business Committee. But many business leaders, for example, have trouble accessing capital as they're starting and growing their businesses. So us, as leaders in very diverse communities, have tried to bring government closer to them. That's our job, to make sure that Washington is doing its best to represent the needs of our community, including our business leaders.
And Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, by the way, was supposed to be here and she couldn't be here. And I know that's she's worked on legislation to increase access to capital and federal procurement and federal contracts, but she was not able to be here today. When it comes to the new majority, though, what have you seen in terms of political influence? Have you seen any benefit in terms of banding together, creating policy change, pushing legislation forward? Has there been any impact of joining forces? Yes or no?
Well, there's absolutely, and I think Grace's leadership has made a tremendous difference. First, on a partisan politics basis, being the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. So she's working on a national level, putting things together across the country. But then on a legislative detail, working with the Asian caucus, the Hispanic caucus, and the Black caucus, we are talking and dealing with issues. And what is important to understand that, and I don't mean to get into partisan politics, but the way the makeup of Congress is, it means a difference with reference to power, because the majority of the people of color happen to be on the Democratic side. So what does that translate to as far as power in policy is concerned? Well, there are 22 regular committees that are in Washington, D.C. If Democrats were in control of the 22, 8 of the 22 would be chaired by minority or so-called minority members. And that is real power when you look at especially the committee and the committee assignments. So these are full committees. And less known, when you start looking at the subcommittee level, then you're talking about an overwhelming number of individuals who are in, and right now, currently, as it constitutes, there's 50 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I think it's 39 members of the Hispanic Caucus and 15 members of the Asian Caucus, and that turns out to be about 18% of it. But when you look at the Democratic Caucus, between those 3 caucuses and women, we would represent the majority of the Democratic caucus. And so that then means a difference in the policies that are set forward by these major committees, who testifies before Congress, what kind of bills go on the floor, because that's all dominated by who's in charge. And we would have a stronger voice and thereby more power. And I think that's some of the struggles that are taking place now quietly behind the scenes, why some don't want to see the change in power, because we're talking about real power, the opportunity to have real power in this country that has never happened before, to show the diversity. My personal matter is that's why, my personal opinion is, that's why, I think that the current president has such a problem with immigration and immigration issues, because he can see how the balance of power can and will change in America.
And I should have mentioned this right off the top, but both of our panelists are Democrats. So this is not a bipartisan representative panel, but this is still the political perspective that we don't have in our other panels. So just keep that in mind. But I hear what you're saying in terms of, it sounds like you're saying that the minority influence collectively would increase if there was a Democratic power. Maybe that'll happen in the midterms. We'll see what happens down the road. But any thoughts on, what have you seen in terms of playing out? Have you seen there be a benefit when majorities band together? in
So-
terms of policy?
As an Asian American, as a woman of color, I think it becomes more and more important, whether it's politics, whether it is in the world of business, to work together as a new majority, as what we call a tri-caucus. And so there might be an issue that doesn't necessarily specifically affect the AAPI community, but if it affects and hurts our brothers and sisters, then it is important, even more so nowadays, for the Asian community to speak up. And so what we've seen, and I can give you a recent example, this is something that is literally going on right now in the halls of Congress. There is a new immigration policy being put forth, supported by the White House. We haven't necessarily seen details yet, but you will hear about it in the upcoming days and weeks. And so this is a plan that, for example, would create a pathway for Dreamers, for DACA, which you've heard much about and which we support. However, at the same time, it wants to take away slots from family unification and also diversity visas. So very generally, diversity visas, and Greg can speak more to this, is something that the Congressional Black Caucus cares about. The family unification visa slots are something that traditionally the AAPI community cares about. And so when this has been brought up in the past few weeks, our caucuses stood together and said, we are not sacrificing any one community for another. And so this was a most recent example of how the Tri-Caucus was able to stay together.
And one of the topics, actually, you touched on this briefly, Congressman Meeks, but one of the topics that I was asked to cover is affirmative action and EEO, equal employment opportunity, and many of the, well, a couple of the panels today have already focused on this, how employers are forced to reevaluate their policies right now in terms of diversity and inclusion. And you touched on this, but how have you seen this playing out in Washington?
Well, I think that I know that the caucuses, and here's where we are working collectively together. We are also going to the business world and saying that they have to be more inclusive of people of color. Now, the way that I see being impacted in Washington, D.C., a lot of times that the associations, whether it's the Business Alliance or the U.S. Chamber or, those kinds of groups, they dominate, the conversation on Washington with reference to business. So we need them, and so I know that we've been putting pressure on them to make sure that on their boards that they have people and women on their boards that then make sure that they're lobbyists, that they're sending to Washington, D.C., because that is good for business also, and it expands the kind of strength that you can have on Washington level. And so the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, we had sent a letter recently to all of the tech agencies, and we would say that, look, who do you have on your board of directors? How many women, how many African American, how many Hispanics, how many Asians? We want a breakdown, and we want to make sure that if you want to interface with all of us, that you are doing the kinds of things that are important to open the doors. When I just see, for example, recently I got a call from Facebook saying that they had brought Ken Chenault on as a board of directors after we had a huge meeting with the CEO of Facebook. And we saw, and now a conversation is now developed as to not only on the board, because we believe there should be more and other folks than just Ken Chenault, should be reaching out to other people, because there's a lot of other folks that are qualified to sit on some of these major boards. But those kind of dialogue, the dialogue that we're having with CEOs directly about who you have on your board of directors and in your C-suites, I see taking effect as the example of what just took place at Facebook and Airbnb and a few others that have recently put minorities on their board of directors.
And I guess I want to hear from you both your thoughts on that, on EEO and affirmative action, what you've seen playing out in Washington, but also any suggestions for enforcement. I mean, we've talked in another panel about, more than 150 CEOs have already signed on to commit to diversity and inclusion, but in terms of policy and enforcement, and actually, it's one thing to ask, to ask them to do this and tell them and commit, but any thoughts on a policy level in terms of making it happen? enforcement?
Sure. In Washington, for example, the House Congressional bipartisan House administration recently hired a staff member on how to work with each individual member's offices on hiring more diverse staff. And I think the Senate is doing work in this area as well. And in terms of so the Asian Caucus, we are working on this diversity report, and we have shared practices, best practices and methods used by companies. We want to highlight the good players, and something that we've seen is, for example, there's a wide spectrum, right? The one is on one end is sort of having events during cultural and heritage months, which is wonderful and very much appreciated. It's something that we didn't even have when we were younger. I'm older than I look. But on the other end of the spectrum, we hear and read about companies who have their C-level executives interacting on a regular basis with entry-level and lower-level staff members who might be more diverse at the lower levels, but are helping them and training them and grooming them so they have the opportunities to move up in the corporate board world or wherever they want to be. So there's a wide spectrum of what can be done and what is more effective.
And before I open it up to audience questions, I want to see if we can talk about solutions or suggestions. This question actually comes from when I was having lunch with John about this before this summit. Do you have any advice or recommendations on how the new majority can fare better with this current administration, as far as, at the employee level, at the corporate, legislative policy level, back down to the employee level? Any advice based on what you're experiencing in Washington about how it can fare better?
This administration, I don't know if the Republicans know how to deal or fare better with this administration, because they have this, number of them that I talk to, and I pride myself in trying to work in a bipartisan manner in Congress. I'm friends with the Speaker. I've known him for a long time. Known him for over 14, 15 years. We almost came into Congress at the time, same time together. But the new developments has become so partisan that it makes it very difficult to understand on how to deal with this administration. The Congressional Black Caucus, upon his election, decided that what we would do, based upon everything that he had said previously, we would give him a document, of which we did. It was a total of about 133 pages as to what was important to the African American community and in business, et cetera. And here's are items of which we could work on collectively if, in fact, he was serious. I will tell you that he has proven not to be serious to talk about issues. The fact of the matter is, the one time that members of the Congressional Black Caucus went to the White House, and they only went on the condition that we would talk business, the president did not want to talk business. He just wanted to take photos, and so that he could say. So at each time we first started the meeting in the conference room, and he was anxious to get into the Oval Office. And the CBC says, no, let's stay right here so that we can deal with the issues that are important to our communities and to our folks. And he said, well, yeah. And then he wanted to know whether or not, he had someone come in actually say that the room was going to be occupied by someone else. He said, okay, let's go to the Oval Office. So we went into the Oval Office, and the first thing that he wanted to do was sit behind his desk and have everybody sit around him to take pictures. We refused to do that. So, the situation is, if you want to talk about serious business, because that's why we're there, we're willing to do that, but we're not willing to play the background for a photo op so that it could look like you're trying to do something. The best way that I think to handle this is, in fact, everyday individuals as well as business individuals with your perspective to get involved in politics. And that's the one thing that I see, and I'm sure Grace can talk more about this. I see Celeste Morris in the office. I got to say this, I wouldn't be here. Celeste was my campaign manager when I first ran for Congress. So she was very instrumental. But in this, you got to talk about saving our institutions and the balance of power. Unfortunately for me, it seems as though that this president is going after the institutions of the United States of America, and that's a great danger, And I'm not saying this on a partisan basis because guess what? I was here when George Bush was president for 8 years. And we didn't agree on a lot of things, but we sat down, we talked. I can tell you the times that we negotiated things and it worked through. Thus far, I've seen no evidence of that from this White House. So my hope is that we can make a difference in the 2018 and have more of a balance of power, and therefore there'll be a difference in the receptions that we're getting from the White House currently. But I Grace may see something, but I don't see anything in that regards. I close on this. A number of African Americans and Hispanics and Asians, I know in the beginning, right after he was elected, some of you might remember there was a number of folks that went up to meet with him. Bob Johnson, for example, was one. There's been no response in reference to the business community subsequent to him becoming president. You don't see them doing any business with anyone in that regard whatsoever. So I have real, serious concerns about the commitment of this administration and its focus on making sure there's diversity in the workforce.
And in light of those concerns, you mentioned I'm looking for recommendations, suggestions. You mentioned getting more involved, having minorities get involved in politics to push that agenda forward. Any other thoughts on recommendations or suggestions given these challenges that exist?
So prior to getting elected in Congress, I worked I was in the New York State Assembly, and I was the only Asian American legislator. So obviously, I couldn't form my own caucus. So I was very lucky to be a part of the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian. They added me. Caucus. And honestly, as a woman of color, I've benefited a lot from my Latino and Black brothers and sisters who've come before me. And so when I got to Congress, obviously people are a lot more established, and I was like just waiting for moments when the Tri-Caucus would work together. And to be honest, when I first got there, I didn't sense it, right? The Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, and Asian Caucus would work on their issues individually, but there were moments when, and I think we can all say this in the different caucuses, that we were like, oh, hey, we wanted to be there and support the Black Caucus or the Hispanic Caucus and what they're working on, and vice versa, I'm sure they felt the same way. And so I think that because of this new political climate, and I won't get too political, but I think people in our shared communities have felt the need and importance more than ever before when I first came to Congress of banding together and working together. The Asian Caucus is the smallest caucus. Greg says we only have 15 members. However, we have a way around that. We welcome anyone to join our caucus, so we actually have 60 members. But all joking aside, it becomes more important for the caucuses to work together. However, there are things that we have accomplished on a smaller level that maybe the president doesn't know about, and don't tell him. So under this administration, we've worked on issues, for example, houses of worship being able to apply for FEMA disaster grant money, and they weren't able to before. So that's something that was accomplished on a bipartisan level. We also worked on a policy that is not, this problem is not as widely known, but it's very important to me. Female inmates in federal prisons across the country now have unlimited access to feminine hygiene products, because that was an issue before. They had to pay for them. And so there are ways that we are working together, and we just have to continue to work together from a political perspective to better mobilize, and for us to reach out to communities that traditionally have not felt like we have communicated with them enough.
I just want to add one quick thing, because the other thing that you can do, oftentimes people just look at Congress, and Congress is like on the political spectrum, the federal piece, but we need to focus on the local levels also. Mm-hmm. The local levels are tremendously important because the rules and regulations that take place on the city and the state level, for like in New York, where we know that the governor has imposed a 30% minority, women-owned business participation rate on all projects in the state of New York. There's a lot of opportunities there. The city is doing various things. And all across America, and we can do this in a bipartisan way. And as the states, as the governors and the mayors and the state legislators, as they are putting in and implementing these policies, number one, it creates an atmosphere, particularly where businesses are existing. It creates an atmosphere where it becomes within their own climate that this is what they would do naturally, irrespective of who's in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. And it also tends, because as Grace and I first started in the state legislature, individuals generally come from the state or the municipal legislative level into the federal level, so they will come with that mindset. So you don't just start at the top or in the congressional level. If you are involved in local elections, that's how we get more people of Asian descent elected and elected to Congress and elected to other places, is starting on the grassroots local level. It makes every bit of difference that you can imagine.
And we have just about 5 minutes left. I have a couple questions, and then I do want to take some audience questions. This one touches on, we touched on this when I was asking about enforcement at the CEO level. Please provide your perspectives on the role of government in driving diversity in corporations. For example, Norway, according to this person, has a government mandate that 40% of board seats must be held by women. So what they're asking is, do you support strategies like this? Do you support government enforcement of these types of strategies? Thoughts?
This is something that literally my office and I are in the midst of discussions about. We know that there are countries who have this enforcement. We are trying to see if and how it is truly effective and accomplishes those goals. So we are looking at it as we're preparing our CAPAC diversity report.
Yeah, I think that it is important. I think that what government needs to do, particularly those corporations and businesses that do business with the federal government, it's important that we know what their ethnic background is and encourage them for diversity. Now, I have concerns in that we've seen recent court decisions starting to curtail it. And the bigger concern that I have is when I look at what this administration is doing on the federal bench level, which I think is very nervous and unnerving to me. The kinds of individuals that you're putting in on a federal court level, lifetime appointments, some of whom, unfortunately, when you look at the people that he nominated, they pushed back on some that never been in a courtroom, never tried a case or anything of that nature. So that as we're trying to do what Norway, or if we try to do what Norway and others would do, we could have courts that will say that it's unconstitutional, as they did with affirmative action in the Bakke decision. And so we've got to figure out ways to be smart about it so that we don't fall under certain legal ramifications that would harm us as opposed to helping us. And so we've got to be smart about it.
And that would stop it from moving forward. Anyway. This one says, please explain your intention and process for developing D&I best practices. We know what they are. It's the execution of them that are the problem. Any thoughts on developing D&I best practices?
You all are the experts. We know that there is a gap, and we all need to collectively work harder to close the gap. We also know that it's important. I will leave the best practices up to you. I can just kind of name them as an observer on the outside, but providing and creating opportunities for people, helping to build the pipeline to make sure that people are exposed to certain careers and that they know of the possibilities of rising in their fields, and mentorship. Mentorship is super important. As someone who was born and raised in New York, I never really knew a lawyer or a politician. I never thought about going into politics because I didn't know any politician who even looked like me. So I never thought of it as a possibility. So I think mentorship and creating opportunities is very important.
I'll add to that. I mean, we've got someone here from the Executive Leadership Council, which is an African-American organization. There needs to be more dialogue and conversation. That's why, John, I compliment you on this. Because where we do have the experts, many of us, as Grace just indicated, we come from different various backgrounds. Now, some that are there who have come from corporate America, they can then talk specifically because they're part of it. But you know it better than us. You know the struggles you have internally. You know those things that you don't like, those barriers that have been in front of your door. So I need to hear from you what those barriers are, and then we can then push from our level. There's got to be a partnership of talking together that has not happened or existed before. We were just talking about how we're going to move forward and getting that done. Getting organizations like this is great, and getting us all together, because then we can develop overall a strategy and put it together and making a difference, so that should I have my wish, and I know I'm not talking partisan, but I'm talking partisan, if Democrats were in control, just as an example, and I talk about financial services because I sit on that committee, Maxine Waters would be chair of the Financial Services Committee. So she would then put in the policies and come out of that committee, those kinds of things that you would talk about that would make a difference. Nydia Velasquez will be chair of the Small Business Committee. So those kinds of issues that were important to Nydia about creating and having access to capital between Nydia and Maxine would help pull things together in that regards. And technology, you know, we've got an African-American from Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson. She would be chair of the Technology Committee and Education. So there's all these major committees that we would be able to work together in to break down the barriers by talking to you that you tell us that's in your way in the first place.
And some of those challenges have come up today in some of the other panels, and I know you two personally can't stay for the entire two-day event, but part of what this is about is to convey some of those challenges to our elected officials and hopefully create policy change. Are there any questions from any of you? I see one hand. That's the first one I saw.
Hello. My name is Fritz McClymont. I'm with Global Diverse Resources, a New York-based international trading company involved in precious metals. Congressman Meeks, you mentioned the Dodd-Frank Act, and I'd like to refer to Section 1502 that deals with strategic minerals. The atrocities in Africa are horrendous. Millions being killed in the Congo around the supply of these strategic minerals to the U.S. And for violations or non-compliance, those are clear in terms of what can be done. I see an opportunity in terms of what the new majority can do in addressing the whole issue of strategic minerals coming into the U.S. And I'd like to know how the Caucus could impact on that. The president last week sent a very flooring letter to the African Union, which speaks not to his prior statements about S-holds, but to the future. I'd like to look at how we, the new majority, can take that letter and take advantage of the expression, the sentiments there to the African Union to address something as simple as the 1502 Act as it relates to businesses here in the U.S. Two issues I'd like to introduce. I think this morning there was a mention of the U.S. dollar falling and its impact on international trade. And if there can be an Afro-Sino strategy that addresses the 1502 along with the relationship between the small and minority businesses here in the U.S., in China, and in Africa, can there be a strategy around those?
Yeah, I think that, one, we're waiting for the president overall on a trade strategy, and this is Democrats and Republicans, because I think that's important as far as, you know, how we're going to do business and where we're going forward. And there's a cloud on which way the president is willing to move on a trade strategy overall. You know, historically had been Republicans were for trade and Democrats were somewhere in the middle. I happen to be one that believes in trade because I think that there's great opportunities to for minority businesses to expand and to work outside of it. So, but specifically in reference to 502 on the Dodd-Frank, yes, I think that we should talk about that. It's something that by calling my office, we can look at it and possibly work together with some of my Republican colleagues. And we're doing that right now. There is dialogue that is taking place on what we can agree upon in committee first, not dealing with the administration, but on the committee level. That's why I say these committees are so important, so that if we can come up with a bipartisan agreement on the committee that this would be good to do, et cetera, then we can pass that on, and I don't have to have any in my name on it. If it helps to have Chairman Henselin's name on it, so be it. But we are talking among ourselves on the committee level. That can make a difference, and we can have further dialogue and conversation with myself in my office on something that specific to see if we can work something on a bipartisan basis.
We have time for one more question on issues that we can all draw parallels from and benefit from. Yes.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's very, very important and informative. My name is Allie James, and I am from Inroads, which is a Korean leadership development organization for underserved and underrepresented young people. And my question is around fixing what seems to be an apparent diversity pipeline across various states of government. If you all remember, there was a lot of discussion in the summer around the composition of the White House interns and the composition of the Capitol Hill interns. And even though we've had the most diverse Senate in Congress in a long time, many of the Democratic staffers are not the new majority. So we know that that pipeline is really critical for national politics. So what are some of the things that the Tri-Caucus is doing to address that pipeline problem? And has this even come up as on your radar, on your table of things to work on?
Well, like I mentioned before, something new that the House side is doing is House administration hired a staff person directly responsible for working with all the members' offices and ensuring that they have, for example, a pool of applicants that are diverse. The Senate, I believe, I don't know too much about what they're working on, but I know that they have implemented a new rule where for all certain open positions that the pool of applicants must be diverse. And so this is something that has come up even more in recent years, including Capitol Hill. Internships are very important. We both work with a lot of advocacy and nonprofit organizations, which one of their main functions is to go out and to recruit interns from a diverse pool, and that's something they provide stipends, for example. So it makes it easier for interns and candidates from more unconventional communities, minority communities who might not head to politics as their first choice.
Let me just add to that. Officially, for example, on the House side, Nancy Pelosi has made sure that there's diversity on the committees, told all of the ranking members now of those committees to make sure that they are interviewing and hiring individuals on committee staff. Each member decides his or her own staff. She's encouraged us to make sure that we do that, as Grace has indicated, but also on the committee staff. Then further, if you talk about just general political positions, whether it's the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, we had, for example, a meeting last week where we had a number of minority vendors, because we want to make sure that they're hiring individuals, but also using vendors and businesses, et cetera, when we do these conventions, that they are diverse. So we are making sure that they're hiring and no vendors out there to give business folks contracts so that we can be hiring them at every level. Not only, so that businesses are not left out, as well as we are asking directly when we're doing business with various companies, what is your diversity? Show us who is part of your executive staff. If you want to do business with us, we want to know those. So those are implementations that we put in place. I can also tell you on the Senate side, I know that I participated, and the reason why I say I'm chair of the Congressional Black Caucus's Political Action Committee, we had a conversation with my good friend, Senator Chuck Schumer, and what they're doing on the Senate side. And I think what Grace is talking about is absolutely what they instituted, is what the NFL instituted. It was called the Rooney Rule. So that every office has to begin, when you're going to hire somebody, to make sure that you're interviewing somebody of color, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and make sure that they are part of the process and in the picture, so that they can be considered and eventually hired on Senate staff. And then we're asking folks to keep numbers, because I know we are keeping numbers, and we're tracking who is where, how many, at what level. It's tremendously important. And I'll close on this. One of the requirements that I know I'm looking at on a Democratic side, because since you mentioned that, is as we're looking at these new elections on a district level, where you have disproportionately individuals that are of color, be it Hispanic, African American, or Asian. We want to make sure that those district offices are hiring people to reflect the community in which they represent, so that there's somebody. I do the same thing in my office. I try to make sure I've got a very diverse staff, because I have a diverse district. And I think that's the appropriate thing to do overall, and I think the members are starting to lean and moving in that direction.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. Congressman Gregory Meeks, Congresswoman Grace Meng. Can we get a round of applause?